I think we're going to see more and more drone strikes hitting inside Sevastopol, hitting inside the air base at Saki, for example. And this is where the administration, I don't understand this continued reluctance to provide ATACMS or other long-range strike capability, because you could imagine if there was an ATACMS that was hitting inside Sevastopol 2 or 3 times a day over a period of time, the Black Sea Fleet commander would have to relocate.
And there's a St. Petersburg FSB, there's a Moscow FSB. There are many different actors that could have carried out an assassination of the Wagner Group in Russia.
I think you're onto something there. Russia is not the strict top-down dictatorship that we imagine it, and Putin is not the iron-fisted leader who brooks no contradiction.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, Ukraine strikes back. Yes, Russia in one night carried out 44 strikes on Ukraine. That's just one night. But what's notable, too, is the fact that Ukraine hit back with drones of its own. The heaviest drone strikes on Russia so far, and more are said to be coming. Russia is no longer immune from the effects of this war launched by President Putin for really no understandable, at least if you're not somewhat logical, reason. In a few minutes, my friend and longtime Russia-based correspondent Fred Weir, who says Putin is not broken by the Wagner event or by the war. Russia will just keep on coming relentlessly in its quest for some kind of victory. But first, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges on American political appetite for war, the support Ukraine needs, and what he believes will be the inevitable Ukrainian counter-offensive breakthrough. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges is the former U.S. Army commander in Europe, and he is now an advisor to Human Rights First. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, thank you, Dana.
First, the news. Look, I'm really interested in your views as a battlefield general who studied war all his life from, I met you in 2003 when you were a brigade commander in Iraq. You've been in the field. You're not an armchair person. I mean, you know warfare. The biggest wave of drone attacks by Ukraine on Russia this week, some shot down, some took out Russian transport planes in Pskov. Russia calls it terrorism. But is the art of war changing before our eyes? And how will this play out in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, do you think?
So what we're seeing is the Ukrainian counteroffensive is playing out in ways that demonstrate a true understanding of operational art by the Ukrainian General Staff. The counteroffensive is so much more than just the ground phase, the guys trying to breach these terrible minefields and the artillery counterfire fight. It's these drones. The drones represent deep strike, but instead of using aircraft like we do or would have traditionally done, they're using different types of drones to go after targets across Russia that are hitting airfields, logistics infrastructure, and also it's important making sure that the Russian people understand that they've been lied to by their own leadership. So there is an information part of these drone strikes, and the fact that the quantity. I mean, these are not just one-offs. This demonstrates a new capability or increased capability by the Ukrainians, who, by the way, are, in my view, the most tech-savvy, innovative soldiers on the planet, bar none. I've been impressed with them for years. But they're also doing this, this commando raid on Crimea a few days ago. That was not just like the Doolittle raid. I mean, they took out a serious radar and air defense site, and that now leaves a big blind spot. The Russian Black Sea Fleet doesn't want to go anywhere near Ukrainian coast because of Ukraine's use of drones. And so I think this demonstration of operational art by the Ukrainians is a manifestation of the changing character of war.
And how is it specifically changing in terms of the Ukraine-Russia conflict? Because, okay, a few drones across the border, and I wouldn't minimize the loss of transport planes for Russia. I mean, that's a big deal. But, most of the drone strikes in Moscow, for instance, have largely missed the mark, or, they've taken out some glass in a building. Do you think it actually changes the conflict somehow, other than making Russians understand that maybe the war could come home? And by the way, the other side of that coin is that some Russians will argue that they have to support Putin more, and they have to support the war even more to protect their country. I mean, it can play both ways.
Yeah, and there will be people that argue for that. But this is not the end of Ukraine's drone campaign. They're learning every time they do it. They're learning about their own technology, which they are creating, as well as some things like these cardboard drones that they have imported. They're learning about Russian air defenses. They're learning about how to improve the payload. So I think you're going to see increased capability by the Ukrainians in that aspect. But also these there's a sort of a knock-on effect. Russian airports are having to shut down all the time. I mean, they're because of drones, just like the Frankfurt airport here would have to shut down, or Heathrow would have to shut down if there were drones detected flying in airspace around the airport.
And so there have been some,
right?
Not from warfare, but they have had to shut down for civilians using drones.
Right. So you think about a country the size of Russia, how important air travel is for just doing business or commerce. This will have an effect.
You've been in Washington this summer. Does this feed the Biden administration's seemingly great fear and paranoia that the war will spread? And for that reason, they have been slow to commit F-16s or ATACMs. I mean, is this a good thing in terms of how it plays out in Washington?
Well, I think it is useful and helpful that nobody from the administration or other capitals have expressed publicly real concern about what Ukraine is doing on its own to hit targets inside Russia. If they were complaining about it or putting pressure on Kyiv to not do it, that would be very frustrating. But I think everybody recognizes that Ukraine has, under the UN Charter, the right to defend themselves. And, the Russians are killing Ukrainian civilians literally every day or night with their strikes against civilian infrastructure. So,
well, and if I can just jump in there, and doesn't that make it ironic and somewhat ridiculous that the Russian foreign ministry turns around and says Ukraine is guilty of terrorism by striking a military field inside Russia, the same military field that then turns around and provides, troop transports to attack Ukraine inside Ukraine?
Right. Of course, this is ludicrous coming out of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the MOD or Kremlin spokesman. They have about zero credibility anymore. I mean, nobody believes anything that comes out of there. I don't think there was a person on the planet that believed any statement about Prigozhin's death being an accident. Nobody thought that, and so those are wasted statements that I don't think move the needle on anybody's policy thinking. What I do think, though, to your original question, is that the Ukrainians are demonstrating that they're not going to sit around and wait. I mean, the U.S. has delivered a lot, but the administration, which deserves credit for that, has failed the critical task of clearly identifying what is our desired strategic outcome. What are we trying to accomplish? Why does this matter? The president, I think, and his administration need to articulate that to everybody, but especially to American people. If they say we want Ukraine to win, which means ejecting Russia back to the 1991 borders, then there's no more excuses about we don't have enough ATACMS, or it takes too long to train an F-16 pilot. Those all fall away.
Here we are, through the summer watching the Ukraine counteroffensive. There is a lot of talk in the U.S. that it just hasn't gone well, and there is disappointment by Western backers, including France and Germany and elsewhere. People thought this would go a lot quicker. But are you still hopeful of a so-called breakthrough in the Ukrainian counteroffensive now?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really put off by these articles that came out, and it seemed orchestrated, frankly, that several of them came out all at the same time. That I don't know who would be seeding these ideas, but nonetheless, they were unjustified criticisms. And it's always annoying when somebody from 8,000 miles away starts, critiquing tactics and what's happening in the fight. I trust the judgment of General Zaluzhny and his staff and those commanders that are actually doing this. And keep in mind that the Ukrainian have been very disciplined on protection of information, what we call OPSEC, operational security.
So General Hodges, what makes you hopeful when you look at what's been happening on the ground? And I know you have some pretty good insights there.
Well, what makes me hopeful is that Ukrainians have protected information. We don't know, and we're not entitled to know exactly what's going on there. We see how they have adapted, which is what winning armies do. You adapt, you change your plan as the conditions change. And they have been going after Russian artillery, Russian logistics with great effect, both with their own strike capability as well as with drones. This is having an effect, and we're starting to see evidence in different places where they have penetrated these Russian defensive belts. Now, I don't know yet, are these so-called second and third defensive belts, are they stronger or are they less well prepared? I would imagine that they will be less well prepared, but we won't know until Ukrainians are able to get in there. But you used the phrase operational art earlier, which I was glad. I like that. The operational art means understanding what is the decisive terrain. That's Crimea. And so they have designed a campaign that is intended, I believe, to isolate Crimea by severing the so-called land bridge. And you can interdict that land bridge not only by occupying it, but with long-range artillery and rockets. And then, of course, the Kerch Bridge, which has already been demonstrated as vulnerable. And now they're starting to do things that make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. I think we're going to see more and more drone strikes hitting inside Sevastopol, hitting inside the airbase at Saki, for example. And this is where the administration, I don't understand this continued reluctance to provide ATACMS or other long-range strike capability, because you could imagine if there was an ATACMS that was hitting inside Sevastopol 2 or 3 times a day over a period of time, the Black Sea Fleet commander would have to relocate. They'd have to move to the east. He couldn't sit there at port while you've got precision weapons hitting facilities or ships inside the harbor.
What did you hear in Washington? Without telling me about your meetings, but I assume some of them were pretty interesting. And you have probably been one of the biggest proponents of the U.S. just getting on with this. If you say that you want to win in Ukraine, or allow Ukraine to win in Ukraine, then give them what they need. And what do people tell you when you're pushing that argument in Washington? What is the resistance to get on with it?
So I would say the vast majority of people with whom I spoke that come from across the spectrum of journalists, academics, retired military, former ambassadors, current serving, the vast majority are frustrated that the administration has not said, we want Ukraine to win, that this is our policy. And so the lack of that results in this, is manifested by this incremental decision making. So there is frustration there, and there is a concern that if the administration does not articulate to the American people what's needed, then support for Ukraine could wane in next year. when I talk to two or three different, let's just say, very senior people within the Department of Defense, what I see and what I feel is a lack of imagination, a lack of understanding of the strategic geography of why Crimea matters. I mean, I'm talking, these are smart, intelligent, hardworking people. But when I say, what about this, and they look at me like, well, they don't need ATACMS, or that's not that important. And I'm like, I'm shaking my head. So what I cannot figure out is, where is the block? Is it at the president level? Is it at the national security staff? Is it in the Department of Defense? The Department of State actually seems more forward-leaning than does the Department of Defense, actually.
So they will get some F-16s from Europe, and the U.S. will provide training, and will allow those F-16s to go because they're under U.S. contract. The U.S. could block it. The Biden administration won't do that. But I mean, it's going to be months. So will they make a difference on the battlefield? And especially this window is closing in terms of, at the very least, winter is approaching. Let's say November creates problems.
So two or three things about that. You're right. It will be a few more months before we actually see Ukrainian piloted F-16s operating in this war. And that's part of the frustration why it took 18 months to finally make that decision. And you could almost, as we've watched the progression of the administration, every month they finally would relent and say, okay, we can do this. Okay, we can do this. It's like, what's going to happen, but why do we have to wait 6 more months or 12 months or whatever? Anyway, so, and of course, Dan, with your own experience, you learn how to fly the aircraft, but then learning how to fight the aircraft, and then having the operation where you've got a flight of aircraft going in, suppression of enemy air defense is part of it. You're prepared to go in and pick up a pilot that gets shot down. All of these things are part of the operation. So that will take some time. They will suffer some losses, and they'll learn from this. But the actual effect in the fight probably is a few months away. And of course, the Russians will be coming after the airfields from whichever airfields these guys are operating. The Russians will come after those. So the Ukrainians will be clever enough to have figured out how to protect that as well. That's one aspect. There's a second aspect of this, though, that I think if you're on the Russian side, you're like, God dang it. Your whole strategy is to hold out long enough for the West to finally get tired. And now you're looking at in 3, 4, 5 months, we're going to be looking at F-16s joining the fight, and probably other capabilities joining the fight. So that's an important statement to the Russians that the West is still committed. I think that's important.
It's important, but political season approaches. I was just in the U.S. and I saw some of the newspaper headlines really surprised me. Like, for instance, why are we giving money to Ukraine when we can't afford fire services in Hawaii? Why? And just this week, there's been a hurricane in Florida, billions in damage. We'll give more money to Ukraine. So, and some of that is planted somewhat by certain aspects of media, right-wing media, which are now saying, sort of actively campaigning against funding Ukraine. And you and I both know the money will get to Hawaii and the money will get to recovery operations in Florida. That has nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy, and it has nothing to do with funding the war in Ukraine, but it certainly affects voting, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that the president and the administration need to get out and explain to the American people first why this is in our interest that Ukraine is successful and that Russia is stopped. This is in our economic interest. And this is also important in how the Chinese view us. So this has significant implications for the United States. The president has.
Why haven't they done that, sir? Sorry, and I don't mean to jump over you here again, and I apologize, but why haven't they done that? I mean, surely it strikes me that their argument that this is in defense of democracy just isn't palatable, just doesn't get digested very well. And that's not to minimize that that's really important, but it doesn't get digested by the average American right now, that defending democracy somewhere in Eastern Europe is important to them.
Yeah. So you're right that there is a deliberate campaign inside the United States coming from the right, which would shock Ronald Reagan to know that Heritage Foundation, for example, is advocating not supporting Ukraine and letting Russia do what it wants to do. This is appalling to me. Now, but you're right, it's not a compelling argument to say that this is about defending democracy, because that's actually not what it's about. This is about protecting stability and security in Europe, which is important for our prosperity as well as European prosperity, and to make sure that this war cannot spread to where a NATO becomes directly involved in it. That's an important consideration for the United States.
And do it now, or face a much larger conflict later.
The Chinese, of course, are watching to see if we're serious when we say protecting the so-called international rules-based order. What we're talking about is respect for borders, sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation. Every American has things in their house that came to America on a ship. That's only possible because of our great Navy enforcing freedom of navigation. These are all the kind of things that are at stake in this war between Russia and Ukraine, and which China will want to see. Are we serious? I think if you can step back for a minute, the president has to explain not only why this is good for us, but the grand strategy that's at stake here. The West, which also includes Japan, South Korea, Australia, the West, we're getting organized now. I mean, the fact that you had the president hosting the leaders from South Korea and Japan recently at Camp David, that was historic in and of itself. But now you kind of look at, here we are 19 months since the large-scale invasion. Look at where NATO is. Look at all of us are producing more ammunition. We're getting our defense industry going again. It feels like the West is getting organized, and that Russia has put itself in a huge strategic disadvantage. We don't want to let them out of that. So their military is suffered enormous damage. Their defense industry is suffered enormous damage. They have been shut off by and large from their European markets for their energy. And China is sort of watching from the side there. Clearly, friends without limits do have limits. And Russia now is approaching North Korea for weapons and ammunition. I mean, think about that. So we don't want to let the Russians out of that strategic disadvantage. The Chinese have their own problems. And so I think the administration has a grand strategy that will benefit all of us in the West in terms of the conditions, the order from which we have benefited for the last 80 years. The only part where I sort of disagree is I think they're so concerned that if we push too hard for Ukraine to win and do certain things, that some of the cohesion that's essential to keeping our 15 nations together, some of that cohesion may break apart, because not every country is convinced, not even some of the geniuses in Washington are convinced that it's a good thing that the Russians are actually defeated.
Last word to you. Will you give me your prediction on what you think is going to happen? Is Ukraine going to run out of road in terms of the time they have on this counter offensive, both in terms of what they can do before winter and also what they can do politically with the West, as there is some waning support now and increased questioning of resources that are going to Ukraine? Or do you think we're going to see a breakthrough, and you think that Ukraine is going to be able to turn this in their direction, and it may come in lightning speed, just a collapse on the Russian side?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because on the Russian side, they have so many problems. There are no soldiers that want to be there. Their best general is in jail, Surovikin. The other one who had any success is apparently dead now, Prigozhin. Putin has made it clear that loyalty is more important than competence. Shoigu and Gerasimov are fortunately still in post. So that means that's a clear message to everybody in the Russian leadership hierarchy that make sure you are seen as loyal. So there's no pushback, there's no new thinking. It's just more of the same. This is a good thing for the Ukrainian side. Secondly, the Ukrainians are going to get through these defensive belts. I'm not going to predict a time because they're having to do this in a way that we would never do it. They're having to do it without air support, certainly for the next few months. But the Ukrainians have been underestimated by all of us from the very beginning, and they continue to perform and do things that nobody or many people did not think was possible. And they know they can't stop because they know what life is like under the Russian control. They also know that they'll never be safe or secure as long as Russia controls Crimea. They won't be able to rebuild as long as Russia controls Crimea because all 5 of their major seaports are either blocked or dominated by the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So they can't stop.
Breakthrough in the next 2 months?
I'm not going to put a time on it. But I think what you said earlier is true. It's like that line from Hemingway where when one guy asked the other, how'd you go bankrupt? He said, slowly and then suddenly.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, great to talk to you, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the privilege, David.
All right, Fred Weir is a longtime correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, and he joins us from just outside of Moscow. Hi, Fred. It's always great to speak.
Always a pleasure, Dana.
You know, they've just now officially used forensics to rule that this was indeed the remains of Prigozhin on board the plane that was downed, but they have yet to say that it was a bomb. Is that expected to be the next thing?
I think they'll have to say something about it, and it seems almost definitely certain that it was some sort of sabotage. Executive planes don't just fall out of the air on their own accord. At least not very often. Almost never happens. And this was a guy who had a very developed security detail, presumably good mechanics. So I think there's just no doubt that he was killed. And I wrote about it, speaking, the day after his death, and didn't have the slightest doubt then.
So now you have people like Solovyov, one of the main television hosts in Russia and Kremlin propagandists, saying NATO did it. And then one of his guests say it was actually the United Kingdom that would carry this out because only the US and the UK would have the means to put a bomb on board that airplane. I mean, why the cat and mouse here? Why doesn't the Kremlin just admit that Putin did this because Prigozhin tried to march on Moscow?
I don't know. I don't think the Kremlin would do that, and it's not for sure that they did. It is an open question that the Ukrainians, for example, who would have motive to kill him, do some pretty elaborate acts of sabotage in Russia. And they kill people. They killed that journalist, Daria Dugina, almost exactly a year ago. They killed another blogger, Tatarsky, last winter. So they do that sort of thing. It just doesn't seem likely. I mean, we're all just having a conversation about it, putting our various thoughts on the table, and that's all this conversation is too. But I think that if Putin wanted to sideline him, get rid of him, he had other means to do it. He does put a lot of people away, or the Russian court system, which pretty much does what the Kremlin wants, does it for him with a legal veneer. and they go away. So why the demonstrative killing? Because that does happen in Russia. There's an edge in Russian political culture where people die in sometimes horrible, bizarre ways. We have a list of people from Anna Politkovskaya to Boris Nemtsov, and we have these poisonings, like Navalny was poisoned at least once, and they create terribly bad publicity for the Kremlin, these events. They make Putin look bad, and we all say, Putin, what a monster. And he had always had different ways of dealing with these people, and Navalny is a really good case in point, because Navalny has gone away. How much do we talk about him now? He churns out these manifestos from prison, and the Russian opposition discusses them a lot, but the Western media pretty much forgotten about him. I'm not advocating any of this, you understand? I'm just saying that Putin has this machine for shutting people up, getting them out of the
But I think in your answer, you demonstrated that anything's possible here, right? Because
anything is possible.
People who have been against the Kremlin have been poisoned or assassinated as far away as Salisbury, England.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there are other ways of silencing them, and that is putting them in jail. But I guess there has always been the question of, does the Kremlin act as one? And the inner circle is probably a fragmented thing which we don't quite understand. And even the intelligence services who Prigozhin was close to, like the GRU, are said to have been split in the past. And there's a St. Petersburg FSB, there's a Moscow FSB. There are many different actors that could have carried out an assassination of the Wagner Group in Russia.
I think you're onto something there. Russia is not the strict top-down dictatorship that we imagine it, and Putin is not the iron-fisted leader who brooks no contradiction. That often stalks the columnists or Russia columnists in the West. But Russia is a much more complex and I think sort of ramshackle place. It's got a jury-rigged power system. It has worked for Putin for over 2 decades, so you can't scoff at it. But it is one in which he is more like the supreme arbiter among squabbling groups, factions, personalities. He can bash heads together. He can order people to stand up and salute. But behind his back, I'm sure they get up to all kinds of stuff. Some of those spectacular murders, like Anna Politkovskaya and Boris Nemtsov, I think were probably done by Chechens, Ramzan Kadyrov and that group, who are one of the groups who operate sometimes almost autonomously within Russia. And the thing that I worry about, or that when I think about these things happening and what they illustrate, is that Russia is not well governed. It's not that it's not law governed. It's not reliably governed at all. And Putin, though he is awfully adept at managing situations, he managed Prigozhin's mutiny pretty fast and adeptly. But there are gaping holes in the system. It is really worrisome. And of course, Putin is the indispensable guy. He may be good at doing this, but he creates the problems, like he created the Prigozhin problem completely for his own purposes. Then he solved it. And now perhaps he solved it again, or perhaps someone else has stepped even in his own circle. The real scandal with all of these killings, the list of people who were killed or poisoned, is that Putin doesn't punish, if it may be that he didn't order the killing of Anna Politkovskaya or Boris Nemtsov, who was shot under the Kremlin wall on his birthday. Like, he may not have ordered that, but he owns it because he has to punish. And because whatever actors did it inside his own circle or inside that magic circle of people that he controls are untouchable. And that's the real problem with the Russian system of governance.
And I guess he also owns it because justice is never done. So they never really arrest the shooter. Although I understand in Nemtsov case, there were a few arrests, but some people walked, and it's debatable, whether who these people were. But the shooter is, or the actor, if it's not Putin, is never actually brought to justice. So that makes you think that the Kremlin, in a way, with a wink and a nod, blesses these events.
Yes, or it's simply the people are too powerful players in Putin's system, and so he lets them get away with it. In any case, it shows that there is in Russia what the Russians call произвол. It's arbitrary rule. If there isn't any set of laws that work reliably for those guys, then they won't work reliably for anybody. It's just, you get on within a chaotic system. And that is what Putin has created. That's the Putin system. And he rides that whirlwind every day, and he's awfully good at it. That's something people sometimes don't notice, but he is awfully good at it. But he's not getting any younger. The system is growing more complex with the war going on, and anything can happen.
Anything could happen, but I don't want to sound cliche, but I know that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there used to be a lot of chatter that Russians used to watch all of the Godfather movies and modeled themselves, in some instances, some of them after the mafia groups that operated in Italy and then in America. And you're almost painting a picture of Putin being kind of the mafia don, the Marlon Brando of the Kremlin, with all this chaos happening below him, and he tries to govern it, and there may be a lot of people acting with his blessing, with his direction, and otherwise under him.
Well, that's a metaphor that people use a lot. I'm going to shy away from it, but this is something like that, like the CEO of a very fractious board of directors, and he can assert his will and does. He can make people do what he wants, but behind his back, God knows what's going on every day.
Well, so if he didn't carry this out, or he didn't order it, rather than demonstrating that Putin has his hand on the button, that he is in control, you could argue that maybe this demonstrates the opposite, and that there is a huge fracture right now in his inner circle, and perhaps a very dangerous one that may play out in the coming months.
Yeah, I don't know. That's speculation. And one thing I've noticed, especially during the 18 months of this war, is that people in the West, and especially in Ukraine, spin these hopeful visions of Russian collapse. Russia can't keep this up. Russia is falling apart, and this is a staple of Western journalism, as you know, to drop a laundry list of problems that Russia faces, very real problems, and and then put a stamp of doom on it. And if I had a nickel for every column or article I read in the past 20 years predicting that Putin is finished, I'd have a boatload of nickels. Like, maybe one day he will be, and that is some frightening thing to contemplate, because he has made himself the indispensable man in a system, and his departure would create instant crisis. But no one lasts forever, and no system solves every problem. So this is a difficult place, but I wouldn't underestimate it. The strength and resilience of Russia, and even of the Putin system. He does seem to weather these things, and maybe there's a split in his inner circle, but I frankly doubt it.
But do you think that Wagner is finished?
In its present form, I think I was just writing about this and talking to people, and I think that Wagner was a creation, and several other of these private military corporations that are based in Russia, but Wagner is the biggest, most famous one, were developed for a purpose, partly a capitalist one. They are businesses, but the Russian state used them, and particularly the Wagners, to do stuff in aid of Russian foreign policy goals, especially in Africa, but in Syria.
In a shadowy way, with some cushion of deniability.
Yes, absolutely. And yet they got stuff done. So they were useful. And in the Ukraine war last year, Putin's original plan, which was to take Kiev and change the regime in one fell swoop, fell through. He fell back on a plan B, which was to keep the war going in Donbass. He relocated those troops, but using mainly not regular Russian forces. It's not often discussed, but the lion's share of fighting in Mariupol, for instance, last year, was done by the Donetsk People's Militia. The Russians were there, and Russian Air Force and Navy were there, but it was the Chechens and other places, in the Luhansk militia. And Putin allowed the Wagners to build up a very large force in that paradigm, that Plan B paradigm, which was mainly designed to not to call it a war, not to get Russian society all in a war mood, or the Russian economy, and just to do it on a shoestring with volunteers and militias and these mercenaries. And Wagner did, I think he himself said he lost 20,000 men in the Battle of Bakhmut. So he was given the right to recruit in Russian prisons, and he built a huge force, and they were awfully well armed because the defense ministry had to provide all this weaponry. And then when those setbacks happened a year ago, in Kharkiv and Kherson, the whole picture changed politically for Putin. He still hasn't admitted it's a war, but in every other respect, mobilization of troops, putting the Russian economy on a war footing, all these things have been going full blast. And after the Wagners won that battle in Bakhmut in the spring, Putin ordered them to disband. Not disband, but they were removed from the front line.
Right,
to sign contracts with the defense ministry, or go to Belarus, or go to camps, or go home. And that's when Prigozhin revolted. And I think that focused minds in Moscow, and certainly in Putin's office, that he had created this to solve his problems, to not have to. But it was a loose cannon, and and a really serious challenge. So he dealt with it, but I think now, right, in Ukraine, the front line is from 1,000 kilometers long, and from one end to another, it's completely run by the defense ministry. There are no ragtag forces of any kind there. And I think that in Africa, in those other places, maybe they'll have these security groups, maybe even Wagner's, but they will not be run by people who are on any kind of long leash. They'll be basically soldiers of the Kremlin.
Last question for you, and I appreciate your time, and that would be, there is a lot of, I was just in the U.S., I mean, there's a lot of criticism of the war, there's a lot of criticism in the upcoming presidential election, it's election season, of money going to Ukraine, how does America exit from this, even though they're not boots on the ground into it, but how does this resolve itself? Is it in America's interest to keep it going? Do you think that within Russia there is increased chatter as well of an off-ramp, whether that be, I wouldn't call them peace talks, but maybe it's an armistice, a bit like the Koreas, North and South Korea?
Well, Russians do talk about it, and Russian experts do talk about it, write about it even. I think that if I'm judging the political mood, certainly in Moscow, it is that some major things have to happen on the battlefield before we're going to talk peace. There's been a real hardening of attitudes, and I guess it's natural since they've lost tens of thousands of people, paid a huge price for whatever they're going to get. There's no going back to February of last year, or any of the options that might have been on the table then. So I think the mood in Russia is we're going to win the war. There's a lot of unrealistic hopes that Donald Trump might come to power next year, or that the West might give up on supporting Ukraine, or that Ukraine might implode. They're the mirror image of all the hopes in the West that Russia might, fall apart. I wouldn't count on it on either side. This war is really grim. I think when the true casualties on both sides become known, we're all going to be horrified. It is just, I don't know, I watch the Telegram channels on both sides, and the carnage is appalling on both sides. And of course, Ukraine is smaller and has a smaller population, and it also has to import virtually all of its armaments from the West. So I guess, and I'm sure I told you this before, that the mathematics probably favor Russia in the long run. And unless the Russian political system collapses, its economy is now gearing to full war status. All of the former Soviet defense industries are working 3 shifts, 24/7, and they're probably going to have another mobilization in the fall, raise another 500,000 men. So I think that the political mood in the Russian establishment is, first we're going to win, or get something we can call victory, and then we'll talk.
It's something they can call victory, yeah. And there's, I guess that one wonders what that might be as this carries on and just gets bloodier and bloodier. Fred Weir with the Christian Science Monitor. Fred, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Real pleasure, Tina. Thanks.
And that's our backstory this week. I'm back from summer. I'm ready to have you make this podcast an even bigger success. Send me your story ideas. And please share the podcast. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.